Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation. My name is Pablo Salmones, and I will be your podcast host. Today's episode is from an event in February 2024. AI and Faith advisor and founder of Sinai and Synapses, Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman, talks about building bridges between science and religion and why it's necessary to build a common future. Listen now to our conversation. Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman is a founding director of Sinai and Synapses, an organization that bridges the scientific and religious worlds. His work has been supported by the John Templeton Foundation, Emanuel J. Friedman Philanthropies, and the Lucius N. Littauer Foundation. And his writings about the intersection of religion and science have been published in the books 7 Days, Many Voices, and A Life of Meaning. And these truths we hold, as well as on the Huffington Post, Now and very many other places. I was just amazed to see how many places, in how many places you've published your work, Rabbi. He was ordained by the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion, where he received the Korakan Prize from the Cincinnati faculty for the most outstanding sermon delivered and oratory. He was also selected to be a member of the first cohort of Klaus' prestigious Rabbis Without Borders Fellowship, a national program that seeks to position rabbis as American religious leaders and spiritual innovators who contribute Jewish wisdom to the American spiritual landscape. From 2007 to 2014, he served as assistant and then associate rabbi of Temple Beth El Northern Westchester, and he appeared on Jeopardy in March 2016. He lives in Westchester County with his wife Heather Stoltz, with their daughter and son. Thank you once again, Rabbi, so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. It's a true honor to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps we can start with a rather simple question, I think, which is, what is Sinai and Synapses? What is its mission and its origins, so that people can get to know you a lot better?
Thank you. Again, this is wonderful to be with all of you, and I see a couple people who have actually been involved with Sinai and Synapses before. So Sinai and Synapses' mission is to elevate the discourse around religion and science. So much of our public discourse is a representation of a larger problem that we're having in our society, as we've seen so many of these conversations that we at least talk about are not religious questions, and they're not scientific questions, they're human questions. And we need as much wisdom as we can find from as many sources as we can, from as many challenges as we're facing in this world. And so many of the discussions that we are grappling with here, at least in North America, and from what I'm seeing all over the world, there's a perception that there's two sides. One side is viewed as scientific and educated and liberal, and the other side is viewed as religious and uneducated and conservative. And there's a belief that if you buy anything from either of those columns, you've got to buy everything in that column. And it's even better if you demonize the other side. And I think many of us here know that that's not only is that inaccurate, it's unproductive. It's not valuable. Because so much of what we need to be able to do is not just share our information, but be able to have and be in relationship with others. This is one thing that we were taught in rabbinical school, is that the only reason that you have any right to speak on any reason is because of your expertise, whether you have a PhD or ordination. That's the right you have to be able to speak. But the only reason anyone is going to listen to you is because of the relationships that you build. And so how do we explore these questions from a perspective of humility and curiosity? How do we explore these gigantic questions, whether that's artificial intelligence, whether that's the origins of the universe, whether these are some of the challenging political issues that we're grappling with? How do we talk about them in a way where we can learn from one another and ideally make our world just a little bit better?
Yeah, and now that you were mentioning this, there's actually something in your website which I found very interesting, precisely regarding kind of like it's normally believed that if you accept an argument from one side, then you have to be against the argument from the other side. And you mentioned that very explicitly in the website. You say that many Jews erroneously think that if they accept science, then they need to reject subject or religion, right? That's something that you mentioned explicitly. So I'd like to ask you, why do you think that is? That's first. And also, and perhaps obviously tied to that question is, why do you think it is precisely necessary to kind of like build these bridges between religion and science?
Those are great questions. Thank you. And I think looking at why we need to bridge religion and science, it's a lot of these questions as to why we need to build bridges in our society right now. I mean, at least in North America, there are a lot of discussions where more people are interested in scoring points than they are in actually solving problems. And there are a variety of different ways to approach different solutions and to be able to say that may be an opportunity to explore. I think about this way in terms of how do we address climate change? How do we regulate AI? How do we deal with all sorts of different policy questions? If we're coming at it from, I am right and you are wrong, which is actually now we're even more at a point of where I'm right, you're stupid, and it's even now I'm right, you're evil. Of course, you're not going to be able to solve any questions. So building those bridges are crucial. And the question also is, how do you build those bridges? One of the things that I learned of a very minimal, not much, but a very minimal experience in doing a little bit of community organizing from my time in the pulpit. And one of the things that came up in our training was to be able to ask people, what keeps you up at night? And what gets you out of bed in the morning? And starting with those kinds of questions, that's actually a fantastic way to talk about some of these gigantic issues. If we're looking at questions of AI and faith, and you ask people, what keeps you up at night? That's actually probably going to be a very personal question. That's going to be something where someone's grappling with an issue that impacts them maybe in their academic work, maybe it impacts them in their family, maybe it impacts them in their society. Asking them what keeps you up at night, that actually then look at the questions that you can actually get your hands around a little bit. And what gets you up in the morning? Well, what gets you up in the morning, that's what excites you, what keeps you doing the work that you're doing. Whatever that work is, that actually allows people to continue to do the challenging work when it seems like it's almost impossible. So the question is building bridges. It's not just to be able to build bridges, although I think that's actually very valuable, but starting at these questions of what are the challenges and issues that we face in our world, and where can we find as much wisdom as we can. So that's why I think it's really, really critical to be able to build bridges. And I think I do not have a PhD. I know many of the people here on this call and through AI and Faith have PhDs. From what I've been hearing and from what I understand, so much of academia has become very focused on one very narrow topic. And when people are working on something, it tends to be in a very, very narrow conversation. And yet broadening that conversation opens up doors, opens up new avenues of research, ways of exploring questions in new kinds of ways. That's also incredibly valuable. How do we not only go in depth, but how do we build a level of breadth as well? That's what we aim to do through our work through Sinai and Synapses. I'm happy to answer the question about Judaism, but I'm also I've been talking for a few minutes, so I don't know if that.
That's no, that's perfectly fine. And now that you mentioned all this, there's just very many things that resonate with me about kind of like the depth of the subjects, but also the breadth of the subjects, and having kind of like taking different points of view, if you will, to solve a question like from different places. And I've always believed it's just one reality. We just see it from different angles, but it's one and the same reality that we're looking at. So it makes perfect sense to see it from so many different places to try to actually arrive at a conclusion, or to kind of like try to solve the most human questions that you mentioned at the beginning. That these are human questions that we posed ourselves as beings, right? So no, it makes perfect sense. Everything that you're saying. I do want to ask you about, because you did mention mentioned in the website precisely kind of like the way in which different religions kind of face these different questions. And in particular, precisely, that in particular, that many Jews think that if they accept science, they need to reject the religion. And that's not necessarily the same with other religions. So, I mean, everything that you just said resonated so much with me. But I do want to ask you that because I think it would be very interesting for everyone here to kind of listen to your perspective on this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think and I want to give a little bit of nuance of a lot of this, I would say, when we say non-Orthodox Judaism, although there is a little bit of an element of Orthodox Judaism as well, engages in this kind of way. Some of this is theological. A lot of it is actually sociological, and particularly in North America over the last, say, 100 years. So there are a couple of different reasons for this. And a reason that I think a lot of Jews tend to celebrate and embrace science, that's one element, and the way in which some Jews have, I would say, ambivalent feelings about religion. So there's a lot of different explanations here, and I'm going to try to I want to give as many as I can, but I'll give at least a few of these. One is that Judaism is not predominantly a religion. The idea of religion is kind of a Western Christian perspective, in the same way that Confucianism is not precisely a religion. It doesn't really capture what Confucianism is. Judaism predominantly is actually an ethnic identity. It's a family. Judaism actually starts with, at least within the Torah, in Abraham's relationship with God, but Abraham is told that you are going to be the parent of a large group of people, right? You're going to be the father of a great nation. And so Judaism, at least a difference between Judaism and Christianity, at least, and this is a huge oversimplification, but it is a little bit of at least a good heuristic here. Christianity, to an extent, is like a club. If you buy into the bylaws of the club, you're part of the club. So in Christianity, right, if you accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you are part of the Christian club there as well. Judaism, the way that you join Judaism is you're either born into being Jewish or you convert, which is the equivalent of adoption. So if somebody, for example, converts to Judaism, it doesn't happen immediately. Conversion actually is over a period of time and study. Somebody comes to me and says, I want to be Jewish. I say, great, let's date Judaism for a little bit before you marry it. Practice Judaism. Then you can decide, do you want to be part of the Jewish community here? So Judaism is not, the idea of religion and theology, it's important, but it's not as important as it is in Christianity. That is one element as to why it's not quite as much of a conflict between Judaism and religion as it is with, for example, fundamentalist Christianity and science there as well. Another part of this is that Jewish text and Jewish tradition, like Christianity and like the other Abrahamic traditions, all are based on a sacred text. Judaism, though, its engagement with texts and study, it starts with the text, but it doesn't end there. There's no concept, at least in for example, of Protestant Christianity or elements of Protestant Christianity, which I know doesn't exist so much right now, but the idea of this is, the Bible says it, and that ends it, and that's the end of the story. That's not how, at least Judaism, looks at some of these questions. Judaism always asks, how do we look at this text? So one example, there are a couple of fantastic examples of this, but one text is in Exodus where it says an eye for an eye, which we read on the surface and it sounds like it's a barbaric law. And the rabbis say, well, eye for an eye, that's what the text says, but it can't possibly mean that because the text also says you should have one law. So how do you do that? If one person has a larger eye and another person has a smaller eye, well, then you can't have a just law. So that can't work. And so there's reams and reams of discussions of where eye for an eye becomes monetary compensation. And it doesn't start with the text, but they look at it and say, what does it make sense in our society right now? Every text gets interrogated, explored. There's the minority opinion. There's essentially kind of peer review in rabbinic literature. And so that's another reason as to why I think Judaism tends to be more open to science. A question I get asked a lot is Jews tend to be overrepresented in the scientific community. And I think that's part of the reason, is that that's part of when people are studying Torah and studying texts. They are interrogating these ideas. They want to be challenged. I tell a story of sharing a Torah study at one point, and I said something, and somebody said, "What are you even talking about?" And there was somebody who was a guest, and they had look aghast of, "Oh my God, they challenged the rabbi." I'm like, "That's great. Let's talk about this here." In the same way that if you're presenting at a presentation or an academic presentation, you want to be challenged a little bit here. And then there's the sociological elements that it often in the 1920s and 1930s, that was a way in which, when the second generation of Jews who were coming into America, that was a way to enter into American society, to be able to have a better level of standard of living, to be able to raise your children. The universities were a great way to be able to engage there as well. So that was also a large part of that. And sociologically, that also linked with tending to be a little bit on the left politically. At least most non-Orthodox Jews tend to be a little bit more liberal, and people who tend to be liberal tend to be a little bit more celebrating science in a lot of ways. Again, it's an oversimplification there as well. So that does become a question of embracing these different ways in which interrogating questions and looking at how do we understand the world. That's been kind of in the DNA of Jewish thought for thousands of years.
Right, and you just mentioned something very interesting about kind of like challenging and asking all these different questions. And I do believe that in the case of AI, for example, we've been asking, it's the first time in a while at least, that there is something that makes us ask these difficult questions and that kind of starts challenging the way we used to see things, right? There are certain words and certain concepts that are suddenly apparently out of nowhere. It's not out of nowhere, but that's apparently it's just as if it had been that way, that are now starting, and being used for something that just 10 years ago someone thought perhaps unthinkable, at least on an everyday basis. People start thinking about, and you see it on the news, that some people suddenly come out and say, "Oh yeah, I think now that machines are intelligent and that they have consciousness and that a soul and everything." And it's kind of like as if those creations that we are responsible for are also challenging our own view of the world. And suddenly we get to see something that for the first time challenges the way in which we thought reality was. Then at the same time, whenever you kind of like use a language and define something, we use a word to define something, then you immediately give some attributes to that thing that you're defining. So I'd like to ask you, taking into consideration both things, the importance of language, and at the same time that people see something and they need to name it because that's just the way we are. How do you think that these terms in general, this consciousness, intelligence, and so are being, what do you think of the way they're being applied to AI right now? Obviously not by everyone, but by some people. What do you think about that, and what's your view on the same?
Yeah, it's a really good and challenging question. And some of that is trying to talk about language, which is a hard thing to be able to categorize. I think these are really reflections on how unique are humans. This has always been the question of are humans, what makes humans special? I think that actually is much more of a religious question than a scientific question, or it's a philosophical question than it is a scientific question, because scientifically we are part of nature. We are animals here, and yet looking at a lot of sacred texts, we view ourselves as unique. And so what I think has become, I wouldn't say it's unique. I think this is a difference of degree and not kind of questions of artificial intelligence in terms of how we interact with technology, because we human beings are deeply connected to the technological tools that we create and what happens when those technological tools take over. That's been something that I think we've been worried about for hundreds of years, thousands of years. These are not necessarily new questions. I mean, I think they are new questions because of what we're able to do in terms of AI. But I think one of the reasons that organizations like AI and Faith are able to have a lot of these conversations is because there are analogies. There are ways in which we think about these kinds of questions. One thing that makes religion unique, and I think where it connects with AI, is on the role of the body. And that's something where religion is very much, it questions our physicality And when we're thinking about consciousness or intelligence, I think we're thinking about those as disembodied intelligences. Whereas religion, and I can speak at least for myself for Judaism, but I know Christianity literally talks about the incarnation, that there is a physical manifestation of God. There is a physicality in Christianity here as well. When we're talking about the relationship of AI and faith and questions of consciousness, I think we are asking what is going to make humanity unique, and also what are the roles in which the physical nature is going to be helpful. If you want, I can give a little example here from a text that I often use from Jewish text and Jewish tradition, if that would be helpful and interesting here.
Yeah, of course, do. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Terrific. So this is a text from rabbinic literature, from the Talmud. This was written probably around in the year 500. This story takes place around the year 200. This is a story that I will say didn't actually exist. This was not a real story, but there's no historical record of this. It's a story between a rabbi who actually was so important that he was just called Rabbi, Rabbi Judah HaNasi, and he is arguing with a Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor is called Antoninus. If you know your Roman history, there never was a Roman emperor named Antoninus. Some people think it might be Marcus Aurelius, but it's a whole series of conversations of the rabbi and the Greco-Roman world, and they often argue back and forth of which way is to be able to think about these kinds of questions, so that a Jewish perspective and a Greco-Roman perspective. They argue back and forth. And Antoninus says, when a person dies, both the soul and the body can exempt themselves from judgment. Why? Because when a person dies, the body is just sitting as a stone and can't do anything. And when the person dies, the soul flies up into heaven, and both of them can say, it's not my fault. This was like, I can't do anything. The body says that nothing's animating me. I've been sitting here like a stone. Don't blame me. And the soul says, I'm flying up in a bird. Don't blame me. And Judah HaNasi says, I'm going to give you this example here. I'm going to give you an analogy. And he says that there's an orchard, and there are two guards, one person who's not able to see, and another who's able to another one who's not able to walk. And the one who's not able to walk but is able to see says, I see these beautiful trees. Let's steal some. And they said, well, we can't do it individually. You know what? Why don't you go on my shoulders and I'll carry you? And the one who can see will direct and say, oh, you should go over here. And the one who can walk will walk. And together they take the figs, and the king comes down and says, wait a second, all these beautiful figs, where are they gone? And the person who can't walk said, well, don't blame me. I couldn't walk. And the person who couldn't see says, don't blame me. I couldn't see. And so what does God do? God puts the person who can see but not walk, puts them on the shoulders and says, I'm not going to judge you individually. I'm going to judge you together, with the body and the soul together. And I find that to be a helpful analogy, thinking about artificial intelligence, and because so many of these organizations and so many different, whether that's self-driving cars, whether that's social media, whether these are Zuckerberg and all the people who are saying it's not my fault, it's the algorithm. It's don't blame me, and yet it's also the actors who are saying, well, don't blame me because I just typed this in. It's the algorithm that created it here as well. And so it's actually not saying it's the algorithm or the person. It's the person and the algorithm together. And I think that's I found that to be a very helpful framing for me to think about, because in the same way that we don't understand the way the soul works, the soul is not something that we can measure. It's a religious idea, and it animates us. A lot of the algorithms are kind of black boxes. We don't know who they are, but the question becomes, how do they get manifested in quote unquote the real world here as well? So that's a way in which we, at least through Sinai and Synapses, we think about these questions of Judaism and science. The rabbis didn't know about algorithms and self-driving cars, but they did understand that there are things that are inanimate and there are things that are animate, and they need to come together to be able to understand how they're judged and who is ultimately responsible.
And you know something, I believe that everything that you're mentioning, Rabbi, I believe it's very deep in the sense of like all the different knowledge that we can extract from that. And then at the same time, we have a huge challenge in front of us, right? Because these different topics, whether it be about religion, philosophy, and also whether it be about artificial intelligence, we're talking about things that every day, like on an everyday basis, like those of us were involved in these conversations, we kind of like try to have an understanding of all these different subjects. But yet at the same time, you have millions and millions and millions of people who don't have, for whatever reason, they may not be even perhaps they were not even given the opportunity to have a deep understanding of these different subjects, and yet they interact with them on an everyday basis, right? Like they suddenly get to a reality that just a few years ago didn't exist, and then they suddenly kind of like have to search for different guidelines or different people that can help them navigate through the difficult times, or what they may perceive as difficult times or challenging times, or at least I think changing times, with all these different new things that are coming. So I have two questions for you on that, regarding that. The first one is, how do you think that all these different conversations can be taken to everyday people? And then the second one is, what guidelines or what sort of principles, if you will, do you think that people can take from Judaism to actually help them again navigate through these different through these different times that we're living?
Really, really hard questions. Again, these are not easy questions, which is why we have these salons and have so many different perspectives here. I think one of the things, and again, I'd said this earlier before, that I think that questions of AI are questions of degree and not kind. These are questions of how we grapple with new technologies. So somebody, and I think actually the person who connected me with AI and faith is a friend of mine, Dr. David Zvi, who has talked about a lot of these questions of, he wrote an article about matzah making and using matzah making as an example of artificial intelligence, of a machine doing work that was supposed to be human done. And what's that going to happen to our world? It's going to end our society, because making matzah it's a very physical act. It's a very intimate act, at least because it goes literally like you eat it here. The machine can't possibly know what all the Jewish laws are of making matzah, because there are some laws there. And now, as he talked about in this piece, 99% of the matzah that's eaten in the world right now is machine made. So there's always some sort of, oh my God, what's going to happen? This is going to upend the world. And then there tends to be a little bit of a correction. Some of how do we deal with the new challenges that we're grappling with, whether that's ChatGPT, whether that's questions of hallucinations, whether that's questions of fake images. I think there's going to be almost a correction here. My favorite definition of technology that I ever heard was, technology is whatever developed after you were a kid. So right, that's it. Like I grew up with record players, and when the iPod came, that was the most amazing thing that I've ever seen in my life. And the iPhone, that was unbelievable. And my kids, like, this is not exciting to them. This is just part of who they are. So we're thinking about, what are the new questions that we're looking at? I think looking at these questions historically is really, really helpful and really valuable, to be able to see how have different religious traditions, different philosophies looked at the ways in which technology has changed who we are. So I think that's been a very valuable avenue for me, to be able to understand what, not just what is the new technology, but what is the history of technology. That I find to be very helpful. And I find that Jewish text and Jewish tradition, again, it depends on what text you're looking at. One of the things about Judaism that is I wouldn't say it's unique, but it is something that it isn't unique in that no other religion has it, but it is something that is it's something that is my Jewish text and tradition, which is that it lists lots of texts and lots of interpretations and lots of analogies. And in the same way that any kind of peer-reviewed paper is going to share, here's what our data is, and here's what our analysis is, and here's what our open questions are. There are a lot of different explorations. Rabbi Danny Nevins has written a lot of really valuable questions about how we think about Judaism and technology. And I think a lot of these questions, again, come back to what I was saying earlier today, which is that the questions that we're facing are human questions. We're not. Some people are curious about, what can I use ChatGPT to be able to create a new code, right? That's a technical question, but that's not creating the existential questions. The existential questions are, what's going to happen to our financial livelihood? Are we going to become obsolete? What's the truth of how fake images are going to influence our election, right? These are not just technical questions. They're ultimately human questions. And humanity, at least, I think most of us in here would say humanity has not changed that much in the last 200,000 years, right? Our human brains have not changed that much. And so the human questions and all religions are grappling with human questions here in this kind of way. So how do we distill what are the core questions that we're looking at? And I would also say every religious tradition has as its core, love your neighbor as yourself. There's some sort of golden rule expressed in some capacity, and yet every religion has outlined different theology, rules, laws, customs that are different from each organization and each different religion. And so how we talk about those questions are going to be different from each group, which is, I like to say, religion is kind of like language. The reason that we have language is to be able to speak. We don't have language just because we have language. Language is a tool to be able to communicate, but we speak different languages. What I may call a cat is a different word than what you're going to talk about as a cat. We may have to translate from one language to another. Each language has its own internal structure, but they all are at their core trying to be able to communicate. In my mind, religion evolved to help us understand the interplay of the individual and the community. How do we balance our individual needs and our communal responsibilities, which is why love your neighbor as yourself is the core question. And then there are a lot, that's the basis, but a lot then gets built on top of that. So as we're thinking about some of the newer questions of AI, I think it's worth going to these core questions of what does it mean to be human? Why is this creating these existential questions?
Yeah, and actually, now that I was listening to everything that you were saying, certainly not saying that passion and spirit are the same thing, but it is. I mean, you do speak about this very passionately, and it's very uplifting. And you do have something in Sinai and Synapses, which you say scientifically grounded and spiritually uplifting.
Mm-hmm.
So these kind of like uplifting talk, I think, that we've had, and the way in which you've conveyed all these messages and the passion that you put into it certainly transmits like through the screen, and it goes, I think, to everyone here will agree that this is such an uplifting conversation, and it's very stimulating, and it's kind of like very many things at the same time. And perhaps kind of like to wrap up, also kind of tied to the questions about building bridges and everything else that we've talked about. Why is it that this scientifically grounded and spiritually uplifting view that you kind of like talk about in Sinai and Synapses, why is that something crucial to the future of our relationship with technology and with artificial intelligence?
Our mission and basis and axiom with Sinai and Synapses is we always want to strive to have the best, most accurate science that we know right now, which we also know it may change. A lot of what launched Sinai and Synapses for me was a lot of the passion for questions of cognitive science and psychology. And about 5 or 6 years ago, they called it the replication crisis. All of these wonderful studies that were done are now not necessarily that accurate. And so we've had to change a little bit, right? I've stopped using some of these studies because we always want to understand what is what is the world right now? How do we understand it? And the best definition of science that I've ever heard is that science's job is to help us become progressively less wrong. I love that definition, that we try to ground on the best and most accurate science that we have right now, with an understanding that science is not a collection of facts. It's a way in which we understand the world, and it's a methodology. And yet that methodology, that can actually create a sense of awe and wonder and curiosity. So much of the conversation that we think of in terms of science and religion tends to be antagonistic, right? It tends to be questions of evolution and creation. It tends to be about women's rights. I mean, you're following politics of what's happening in Alabama and IVF, right? These are all these questions where, when we think about science and religion, conflict sells. That's what we are talking about. And yet, there are ways in which we are exploring these questions of, what is the science having to say right now? And how do we uplift as many people as we can? Which, by the way, means that some people are going to disagree. And that's as it should. In Hebrew, the word shalom, which means peace, is related to the word harmony. And so harmony can't ever exist with only one note. Harmony comes when there are multiple different notes here. Now, different notes doesn't necessarily lead to harmony. Different notes might lead to discordance, but you do need to have difference. You do need to have multiple different perspectives and trying to understand, how do we uplift as many people as we can? Some of that is personal, some of that is societal, some of that is global. At the same time, our feeling is that we need to know what the science has to say. And the only way that science can happen is through scientists, is people who actually are doing this research. And so that's how we try to explore these kinds of questions. And these are questions where we want people to walk away saying either, I hadn't thought of it like that before, or wow, I have a new perspective on these ideas. We're very much generalists through Sinai and Synapses. As, a lot of what we say, we want our team to be sharp. We want the individuals to be sharp so that our team is well-rounded.
I think that's a great way to finish, and a great way to summarize everything that we've been discussing throughout this salon. Rabbi, it was a true honor to have you here. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your wisdom and your words and your passion and everything with us. I think this has been incredibly stimulating. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.